Hey, funny seeing you here. Didn't expect you. This is part two. So if you're doing this one first, this is not the first one. Go back to part one, do part one first. This is part two. Now we're in the story Marine Corps issue by David McLean. Let's go back and talk about some of the things that have happened up until this point. Remember, Jonathan Allen, who was originally named Charlie, which freaked Dad out, wants to know more about his dad's Vietnam service. However, Mom doesn't want to talk about it. Older brother does not want to talk about it. Dad definitely doesn't want to talk about it. And so our narrator, Johnny, as one watched a movie on Vietnam, Apocalypse Now. He has read a couple books on Vietnam, a few books on Vietnam, but he's decided that he needs to take the next step and go check out those foot lockers, those locker boxes that are out in the shed. Remember, they're all locked, and Dad has the one and only key. But Johnny has come up with an idea to switch out the keys and open one box one day, a second box the next day, a third box the following day, in a way, in an attempt to figure out who his dad is and what makes him tick. Now, go to my website, go to ninth grade, go to units, go to fiction, and then pull up Marine Corps issue. You can join me on page 627. I do want you to read along, even though I'm reading. Help back it up in your brain and read the words with me. So we left off second full paragraph where it says the next morning. Go there. The next morning, I rose as early as my father, much to his and my mother's surprise. My mother was in the kitchen scrambling eggs, and my father was in the shower, as I had hoped. I slipped into their bedroom and with nervous fumbling fingers forced the key number 1 off the key ring, replacing it with my found key. The key ring was tight, and I slipped in my haste, gouging my index finger in doing so. I left the bedroom with my slightly bleeding finger in my mouth, jamming it in my pocket as I passed my mother in the kitchen. Later, quietly, with an archaeologist's caution, I moved the coffee cans from the top box and set them on the work table. I then slipped in the key and flicked open the lock. Despite the heat, I felt the shiver through my back and shoulders, my body reminding me that I was crossing some line of knowledge, transgressing some boundary of my father's. My hands shook, and I held my breath as I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a yellow newspaper clipping, the death of James Dean. He was an actor. Carefully cut to keep the date intact. I read the whole article with interest. I knew nothing of his death. Then I saw my mother's high school diploma, class of 1955, stacks of old photographs, family snapshots, black and white with wavy white borders. I found my old report cards from early grade school and all my brother's report cards up to the 6th grade. I found a baked clay saucer with a tiny handprint pressed into it and Johnny, 1968, scratched on the back. It was all interesting, but not my reason for the risk. So I lifted out the tray full of family memorabilia and set it to one side. Underneath, I found uniforms, dress blues neatly pressed and folded, a shoe shine kit, a drill instructor's Smokey the Bear hat, little plastic bag full of Marine Corps emblem pins, like the one on the hat, a tan uniform, and the yearbook my father had pulled out 6 years before for his visitor. It was a thin platoon book dated 1964, San Diego. I flipped slowly through the black and white photos, looking for the pictures of my father. The photos were mostly headshots of similar-looking boys in dress blues and white hats. I found action shots of boot training, of the mess hall, of track and field competitions. I saw my father here and there, leading a parade, demonstrating a hand-to-hand hold. He was still youthful and very muscular, stern-looking, but not wary. The picture of him in his dress blues was the same one I had learned to call Daddy before I had met him. He looked normal in the photographs, the vulnerability gone, his arms strong and well-shaped like solid tree limbs. Upon looking through again, I noticed small notations next to a few photos. KIA, followed by a date. That means killed in action. So some of the people that Dad met while training ended up heading off to Vietnam and losing their life. So Dad noted it with KIA, the date that they died. I was looking at dead men. I didn't know it then, but I would go back years later and find a picture of my namesake, Jonathan Allen Whitney of Hinesville, Georgia, in that book. But that was all, and it amounted to little. I replaced the tray and closed the lid, reconstructing the tool shed as well as I could. That night at dinner, I waited for the explosion, the accusation, my father holding up the key ring, his tight voice burning through me. I saw it all, but it never came. Later in my room, I sorted through what I had seen and made notes in my journal. I hadn't learned much, except that my mother had loved James Dean and was a curator of her young son's lives. As for my father, I found little new, except the images of a younger, stronger man. So box one, the top box, didn't really have anything that revealing, just memorabilia. I opened up the second box with less trepidation, half expecting to see my mother's junior prom dress folded neatly inside, a dry corsage still pinned to the front. Instead, I found memorabilia that probably should have been hanging on the walls inside the house. So this is the second box now. In the top tray were 3 wooden plaques commemorating different things my father had done all before the war. There was a homely little plaques given to him by platoons or his friends. His dog tags lay wrapped in a green handkerchief underneath the plaques. Joseph D. Bowen pressed into thin aluminum. The tag read Methodist, which surprised me since he never went to church. I found a pile of old letters written by my mother, which had been mailed to an address in San Francisco. I couldn't bring myself to read them. I did, however, find 3 letters dated shortly after my birthday and opened them. One contained the expected photograph, the usual hideous newborn, with the words, "Hi, Daddy, love Charlie," written on the back. I thought all newborn babies were beautiful. At least it's him making fun of himself, right? There was another photo of my mother with Joe and me. Joe was 2 and I was just weeks old. The picture was taken at my grandmother's house and dated June 30th, 1964. Beneath the tray, I found more uniforms, khakis this time, combat style fatigues with Bowen stenciled onto them. There was also a pair of worn black boots, a canteen, 2 thick belts, and a cigar box full of uniform ribbons and their matching medals. Vietnam service, the crossed rifles for marksmanship, and others. There was an unexpected find, a Purple Heart. He had been wounded. I wondered where. His hands, perhaps, or the fairly large scar on his left thigh, a childhood farming accident, he had told us. I was staring at the medal, trying to open my imagination when I heard the back door of the house swing out and bang against the siding. I threw the medal back in the box and the box in the locker and hurriedly shoved everything else inside. I pushed on the lock as the footsteps left the patio and heaved the first box back on top. I was arranging the coffee cans when Joe walked in. "Hey, what are you doing?" he said. I was sweating, but felt the twitching relief that it was only Joe. "I'm looking for a nut. I need one for my bicycle." I dumped one of the cans over and began sifting through the dirty nuts and bolts. Joe walked around, glanced down at the wall, and began sifting through the pile with me. "I need one for the seat," I told him. He quickly handed me a nut. "That'll do," he said, then added, "Hear what happened?" "What?" "Some old farmer set his fields on fire this morning. Acres and acres are burning." "Where?" "Just east of town, off of 111. You can see the smoke from the front yard. I thought we could drive out and see it." "Why do you do that? Why do you do it?" "I don't know. Just mad, probably. Wasn't doing him any good dying there in front of him." There wasn't much to see, really. The flames weren't huge, just crawling slowly across the field of dry stalks, crackling softly. Large glowing leaves whirled into the sky and became flocks of black birds in erratic flight. A few other people had pulled over to watch the highway from the highway before a patrolman came slowly by and moved them along. Joe asked if the fire department would put it out, and he said no, there was no real danger, though the farmer would be fined or something. He said it would burn itself out in a day or 2. We saw a man near the farmhouse about 100 yards from the road. He was old, wearing a red baseball cap, sitting on a tractor, watching the wall of black smoke rise from the field. That's probably him, Joe said. That night, my father came home with 2 tickets to a Cardinals game against the Mets. Box seats, he said, dropping them on the table. He was as excited as we had ever saw him. Shining eyes, a slight smile, nothing showy or too expensive. Let's go, Johnny. From the car, I watched the thin sheet of black smoke rise harmlessly like a veil on the horizon, not the ominous black plume that comes from a single house burning. I told Father about Joe and me driving out to see the fire and about the old man on the tractor. My father just shook his head. We were driving by his old office at the steel mill, a different kind of fire and smoke shooting from the stacks. Poor old man, was all he said. I kept looking at the keys hanging from the steering column, expecting a wave of recognition to light up his face any second. I couldn't imagine how he would react, though I considered anger to be the best guess. What I was doing was wrong. I knew that and felt bad about it, especially since he was in such a good mood. Pardon. His face was relaxed and peaceful, and he was smiling. He'd fought in the war. He'd been wounded in some unknown place. His hands gripping the steering wheel like arthritic talons. His friends had been killed, and his sons had grown without him. I imagined him weathering bitter nights, and he was driving us to a baseball game, sliding easily through traffic. I kept glancing at his profile, the thin hair touched with gray, the deep circles under his eyes, the rounded nose. My nose. We were crossing the Mississippi River on the Poplar Street Bridge. The arch was a bright filament in the afternoon sun. The river was remarkably low, looking as though you could simply wade across the once unswimmable strong current at distance. I considered telling my father everything right then. I was consumed by guilt, tapping my finger on my leg. What happened to your finger? He asked. Nothing. Got it on a nail in the tool shed. I was looking for a key for my old bike lock. I'd had that excuse saved for 2 days. I couldn't look at him. I watched people in the streets. He began talking baseball. It had always been the bridge between us. There had always been a gap in one bridge, a love of the game. The game that night was exciting, a pitcher's duel with outstanding defensive plays. We'd never sat together in box seats before, and we marveled at seeing everything so up close up. How quickly the game really moves. We talked baseball all night. I kept score. I marked every pitch on the card like a memory. The game went into extra innings. I didn't want it to end. I knew even then that this was the first time I had ever felt really close to my father. We shared a soul that night. And then in the bottom of the 12th, the game ended suddenly with one swing by Ted Simmons, a crack and a long home run disappearing over the left field wall. We drove home happy, though quiet from fatigue. Strangely, he passed our exit and continued around town to the east. You missed our exit, I said. I didn't miss it, was all he said. He was pensive. I was puzzled, but only for a few minutes. We turned down Route 111 and headed south on the dark highway. Suddenly, the land to our left was a glowing pile of embers. We could see little smoke, but the field was alive with orange fires flickering and rising like fireflies. My father clicked his hazard lights and pulled onto the shoulder. We stepped out of the car and walked across the still road with me trailing behind. The unseen smoke was too thick. I coughed and my eyes burned. I just wanted to see it, he said quietly. And we stood there in silence for 10 minutes before driving home. What do you think that Dad had to go see this fire? What was that all about? He just kind of pulled her on the side of the road, checked it out for a while, got going. What do you think? I didn't notice the ashes falling until after I'd changed the second key for the third. I was walking back through the kitchen when I saw out of the corner of my eye a leaf fall against the window screen, break into pieces, and then disappear. I looked up and out the window. The wind had shifted in the night. The ashes from the cornfield were swirling above like elm leaves in autumn, some falling gently to the earth like a light November flurry, except that the flakes were black. In the backyard, I held out my hand to catch one and it disintegrated in my grasp. The temperature was already over 90 degrees. It was a wonderful and hellish sight. Ashes blew across the patio and collected in the corner against the house. I don't know if you remember in part one, but Johnny said at one point the way he thinks about his dad is either playing the handball or in amongst falling ashes. So we're clearly getting back to that point. What is it all about? We'll find out. After my father left for work, I went down to the garden to read. Ashes drifted down, breaking between the pages of my books and landing in the daylilies and roses along the fence. I felt strangely uninterested in the third box. The previous night had left me content with my knowledge of my father's past. A new understanding had come to our relationship. I felt guilty opening the third box as though I was breaking some new agreement between us. The top tray contained nothing of interest. I found shoe polish, dried and cracked, 2 more plaques, socks, 2 dungarees. I sifted through these things mechanically, quickly, wanting to be done with it all. The compartment beneath was only half full. A musty smell rose out of the box. It came from the clothing, an old khaki uniform, tattered and worn, filthy, but neatly folded, that lay on top of the items inside. Also within sight was an old pair of combat boots, unpolished and ragged. They too smelled musty. I lifted out the uniform, found a small box made of dried palm fronds. It was poorly woven around narrow sticks with an ill-fitting lid on top. Inside it were yellow newspaper clippings folded up into squares in a small paper ring box. Should have brought some liquid with me before I started this beast. I unfolded one of the clippings carefully so as not to tear its tightly creased edges. The headline read, "Local prisoner of war to come home." It was accompanied by the same photograph of my father in his dress blues. We're getting to the point. We're getting to the point and figuring out why Dad has not shared his experiences. The clipping was dated July 13, 1969. I read the article slowly, trying not to miss any details. They explained that my father had been a prisoner for just over 3 years, that he had been released July 30th, and that he would be returning to the base in San Diego within days. He was being held in a prison camp in the north, just above the DMZ, and had been captured while on patrol near Quezon in 1966. It gave details about the family in Stone City. I set the clipping aside and quickly unfolded the others. They all told the same story. One was from the Stone City paper, dated the day of his release. I read them all twice, almost uncomprehendingly, before carefully folding them and returning them to the homemade box. I was a little afraid to go further, but I picked up the small paperboard box, felt it rattle, opened it. Inside were teeth, all molars, yellowed and with black spots in places. You know what a molar is, right? I picked one up. On closer inspection, the black blemishes became legible. Painted on the side of the molars in tiny letters were NV3366. I picked up a second. It read NV51266. All 6 of them had dates, 3 from March 3rd, 1 each from 3 other days. I was breathing through my, okay. These are other dad's teeth that got pulled out of his own skull. Or these are people that dad killed and he pulled the teeth out of their skull. War's not nice, right? All 6 of them had dates, 3 from March 3rd, 1 from 3 other days. I was breathing through my nose in a deep mechanical way, sweating heavily in the hot late afternoon. I put the teeth back in the box and set the box aside. I was shaking and didn't want to continue. There were There was more to see, a few letters, some folders, a small book. The book was a paperback, a Marine Corps field manual bound with a manila cover. It was titled Escape and Torture. I began flicking through the pages. There was some small meaningless diagrams, adult text about techniques for escaping from some generalized prison camp. Then there was a section on Vietnamese torture techniques. I began reading the clinical, distant descriptions of various forms of torture: naked men in small, cold concrete cells, sleep deprivation, swelling legs, tied hands, beatings. A few pages into the text, the notations began. They were written in black ink, always a single word: this. In the margin next to an underlined passage. The first, as I recall, describes something with the feet, then beating on the legs. This. Then the hands. This was bamboo splinters under the knuckles. This was beating the knuckles. This was being strung up by the wrists. I felt my stomach go hollow and my comprehension numb as I stared at that awkward, childlike scrawl in the margin of each page. So, what is this? These are things that happened to Dad. This is him denoting torture techniques that were used against him when he was a POW. Remember, we saw the flag earlier, the black flag with the emblem, the sideways silhouette. Dad was a prisoner of war, and he was tortured for 3 years. Is it any wonder he didn't want to talk about it? Is it any wonder that he kept all connections with his past and his military experience hidden away and locked away in these locker boxes out in the shed? Is it any wonder why he keeps it from his family? Now we know why his hands are the way they are. And interestingly enough, the lock boxes, the deeper you got in them, the deeper the stuff got, the more the stuff that he wanted to keep hidden away from the world. I didn't hear my father walk into the tool shed. He appeared suddenly, as though he had sprung from the ground. I felt the presence and turned to see him standing there in the doorway of the shed, holding his key ring in his right hand and my useless bronze key in his left. I had never seen such confusion on a man's face. He was startlingly angry. I could see his body stiff, his nostrils flaring, his breathing heavy, his jaw muscles rolling beneath his skin, but his eyes were wary, even desperate. We stared at each other while he decided what to do. I didn't move. I said nothing, only watching him. His eyes welled, bright molten tears ran down his cheeks. And he dropped the single key and walked away. I rose and walked out of the dark shed into the hot sun and the falling ashes. He was sitting on the edge of the garden with his head down, his eyes closed as if in prayer, his hands lying loose and unattached in his lap. He then moved them to his sides and began clawing at the dry dirt in the garden until he had dug 2 holes and half buried each hand under the loose dirt. He sat as still as a memorial statue, and I realized that I didn't belong here. I didn't belong there. I left him with his head down, eyes closed, and walked into the house. I see him there every day. So why did Dad leave the shed, go kneel down in the garden, and bury his hands? Why did Dad keep the lock boxes in the shed? Why did Dad not want to talk about any of it? And I'll answer that for you. Dad had went through so much pain and horrible things. He wanted to keep that part of his life locked away. He wanted to keep his family from experiencing the pain that he went through. I mean, he had to go through it. There's no reason his family had to go through it as well. As there's no reason his family had to know that. And he was trying to protect them from that. And so his hands are a visible reminder of what happened to him. And in this moment, he doesn't even want them to be seen. He doesn't want them anywhere around, which is why he buries them, which is why he keeps lock boxes, which is why there's nothing plastered on the wall, which is why Dad doesn't want to talk about it. He wants to get past it, but he already suffered. There's no reason for his family to suffer too, right? Heavy, heavy stuff. In the 4 years that he lived beyond that moment, he told me a little about the war. It was a topic I could never raise. On occasion, if we were alone, he'd begin talking about some aspect of the war or of his service. Those are heavily guarded moments, slow monologues, as he groped for the correct words to tell me. It was another way I remember him, speaking of the things that he knew he wasn't capable of saying. This is how I love him the most, this great man. Semper Fi. Well, Dad was a little upset when Johnny found out the truth. In years following, though, now that the door had been opened, he did talk to Johnny about it a little here and there. But notice it was on his time when he chose and what he chose to talk about. Because it's very personal. And like I said, he didn't want his family to suffer. All right. I do believe you have a worksheet lined up for this. It is currently Monday, which means I will be back the following day. I'm sure we'll have rock and roll stories to share with you. We'll talk a bit about this story. We'll talk a bit about vocab. Head on over, get that assignment taken care of. And once again, make sure you are respectful to the substitute. They deserve respect and more. All right. Catch you on the flip side. We'll see you. Have a good one.